Thank you. Thanks very much. So good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here. And as you just heard, it's a special pleasure for me to be speaking in New Mexico. In fact, I think this may be the first time I've ever given a professional presentation in New Mexico. So it's great to be back here. I did not, okay. I did not grow up in Santa Fe. I grew up, as you heard, in Artesia. But I have to confess, if you promise not to tell anyone in Artesia, that my wife and I both prefer Santa Fe now. So I'm here tonight to talk to you about my new book, or recent book, Superminds. And I'd like to start by giving you two of the main messages of the book. The first is that I think we should spend less time thinking about people or computers and more time thinking about people and computers. Less time, for instance, thinking about how many jobs computers are going to take away from people, and more time thinking about what people and computers can do together that could never be done before. So that's the first message. The second message includes that first one, but goes much further and deeper. The second message is really about a new way of looking at the world. In a sense, what I'm going to do now is show you how to see ghosts. Now, I don't mean real ghosts, if such things even exist, but I do mean powerful entities all around us, all the time, that are mostly invisible unless you know how to look. These ghosts are superminds, which I define as groups of individuals acting together in ways that seem intelligent. Now, with that very broad definition, superminds really are all around us. These supermind ghosts are everywhere, including in our room tonight. For instance, every hierarchical company you've ever heard of is a kind of supermind. It's a group of individuals acting together in ways that at least sometimes seem intelligent. Another kind of supermind is a democracy, whether that's part of a government or part of a club or some other kind of group. A very important kind of supermind are the markets we use for all kinds of goods and services. And communities are also important kinds of superminds, whether it's a global scientific community like the one shown here, or a local neighborhood, or many other kinds of groups. Now, one of the first things you realize when you look at the world with all these supermind ghosts all around us is that these superminds run our world. Almost everything we humans have ever accomplished, from inventing writing to making the turkey sandwiches I have for lunch almost every day, almost all of those things were not done by single individuals acting alone. Those things were done by groups of individuals working together, often over time and space. Now, like individual humans, some of these superminds are really smart. Some of these superminds are pretty stupid. Sometimes we really like the things these superminds do. Sometimes superminds can be evil. But whether we like them or not, we can't accomplish much of anything without somehow working with or influencing these superminds that are all around us all the time. So that's one of the first things you see when you look at the world and see all these supermind ghosts all around us. Another thing you see is that computers have the potential to make these superminds smarter. To take just one of many, many possible examples, let's think about Wikipedia. where thousands of people and thousands of computers all over the world created a new kind of supermind. The editorial group, the editors of Wikipedia, is a supermind that in turn created the largest encyclopedia our planet has ever known. So that's an example of how computers enabled a smart supermind to do good things, a good example. It's also possible, however, for computers to help make superminds more stupid, like when fake news influences voters in a democracy. But I think if we use them wisely, these computers have the potential to help us create human-computer superminds that are smarter than ever before. One way of framing the core question about how to do this is this: how can people and computers be connected so that collectively they act more intelligently than any person or group or computer has ever done before? Now, that's a pretty hard question. But one thing that can help us answer that question is to understand the difference between two kinds of intelligence. The first is specialized intelligence, the ability to achieve specific goals in a specific environment. The second is general intelligence, the ability to achieve a wide range of goals in a wide range of environments. Now, here's something a lot of people don't know. Even the most advanced computers today have only specialized intelligence. For instance, the IBM Watson program that beat the best human player of the game show Jeopardy, that program, I know from the person who led its development, that program couldn't even play tic-tac-toe, much less chess. It was very specialized for the particular problem of playing Jeopardy. At the same time, any normal human has far more general intelligence than today's most advanced computers. Even a 5-year-old child, for instance, can carry on a sensible conversation about a much wider range of topics than today's most advanced AI programs. So that's today's state of the art. An obvious question is, when will that change? When will we have human-level general artificial intelligence? Now, if you give a survey to ask this question today, the answer you get would probably be something like about 20 years from now. Now, some of you may find that very exciting. Some of you may find that scary. But here's something else a lot of people don't know. People have been asking this question, when will we have human-level AI, ever since the beginning of the field of artificial intelligence. And the typical answer they got to that question was always about 20 years in the future. So human-level AI has been about 20 years away for the last 60 years. Is it possible that this time the prediction could be right? Yes, it's theoretically possible. But I think we should be very skeptical of anyone who confidently claims that that will happen. In my own view, it is likely that someday we'll have computers with human-level intelligence, but I think that day is likely to be many, many decades in the future. Part of what that means is that in the meantime, all uses of computers will have to involve people. Now, one way people talk about that today is to say we need to have humans in the loop. When they say that, they're often thinking about one person, one computer. But I think a more useful way of thinking about this is to start with the human-computer groups that have accomplished almost everything we humans have ever done, and add computers to those groups. Then we can use the specialized intelligence of the computers to do the things they do better than people, like arithmetic and certain kinds of pattern recognition. And we can use the general intelligence of the people to do everything else. Perhaps even more importantly, we can also use the computers to help create what I call hyperconnectivity, connecting people to other people, and often to computers, at scales and in rich new ways that were never possible before. Now, I think we often overestimate the potential of artificial intelligence, perhaps because it's so easy for us to imagine computers as smart as people. One reason it's easy to imagine that, I think, is that our science fiction is full of it. But unfortunately, it's much harder to create such machines than it is to imagine them. On the other hand, I think we often underestimate the potential of hyperconnectivity, perhaps because in a certain sense, it's easier to create hyperconnectivity than to imagine it. We've already created the most massively hyperconnected group of people on our planet, with billions of people connected to the internet. But I think it's still hard for us to even imagine how that network, how that hyperconnected group can do things today, much less what it will do in the future. So one way of summarizing what I've just been saying is to say that I think we need to move from thinking about humans in the loop to computers in the group. That's my slogan for you today. But how could we do that? How could we create more intelligent human-computer groups? One way that I think can help us think about that is to think about the cognitive processes that any intelligent entity needs, whether that's a person or a computer or a group. In order to act intelligently, you need to decide what action to take. To do that, you usually need to create some possible actions. You can usually do those two things better if you can sense the world around you and if you can remember the past. And if you're really smart, you can learn from your own experience to do all of those other things better and better over time. So those are one way of classifying the 5 basic cognitive processes that any intelligent entity, including a human-computer supermind, needs to do. What I want to do now is give you several examples of how computers can help superminds be smarter in doing those 5 different things. Let's start with the decide process. And one of the most important parts of my book, I think, is a framework of 5 basic types of superminds for decision making. The first and most obvious is hierarchies, where the group decisions are made by delegating them to individuals in the group. The second is democracies, where the group decisions are made by voting. A third is markets, where the group decisions are really a combination of a whole lot of pairwise agreements between individual buyers and sellers. And a fourth is communities, where the group decisions are made by a kind of informal consensus based on shared norms and reputations. Now, all 4 of those types of superminds require at least some amount of cooperation among the individuals in the groups. But if you have no cooperation among the group members, you have the 5th kind of supermind, which I call ecosystems. In an ecosystem, the group decisions are made by the law of the jungle. Whoever has the most power gets what they want, and the survival of the fittest. Now, in the book, I give a number of examples of how computers can help make these different types of superminds more intelligent. I want to give you just a few tonight. Let's start with democracies. First example I'd like to share with you is something called the Good Judgment Project. This is a project done at the University of Pennsylvania, funded by the US intelligence community. Their goal was to predict geopolitical events, like whether Serbia will be officially granted EU candidacy by a certain date, or whether Brexit will occur by a certain date. They wanted to just not predict whether it will or won't happen, but to predict the probability that it will happen. Now, one way of doing that would have been to go to world experts on the particular things you're trying to predict, like specialists in Serbia or something like that. But in this project, they did almost the opposite. They said, anyone who wants to, anywhere on the internet, is welcome to make these predictions. We're not going to pay you, nothing like that. It's just for fun. And then they said they waited several months till the things they had been trying to predict had either happened or not. And they picked the people who had been most accurate at predicting, the 2% of the most accurate forecasters. They put those people in groups of about a dozen people each. They let them talk to each other, share notes, etc. And they also used some special statistical techniques to combine their predictions. They called these people super forecasters. Here's a picture of two of those super forecasters. This is a couple from Australia. One of them is a management consultant. One of them is an investment manager. Neither of them was a world expert in anything in particular, but they were both apparently very good at taking publicly available information, most of it from the web, logically analyzing that, and making sensible predictions based on that information. Now, it's not completely obvious how to judge how good these predictions were, but we do have one tantalizing hint from someone who was part of or had access to the US intelligence community and who also knew about the Super Forecaster project. This person was quoted in an article in the Washington Post as saying that the super forecasters performed about 30% better than the average for intelligence community analysts who had access to all kinds of top secret data. In other words, if you select, train, and combine predictions from a more or less random crowd of people on the internet, you can get predictions that are about 30% better than the entire multi-billion-dollar US intelligence community does. I think that's pretty interesting. So that's my first example. Here's another example. This is about liquid democracies. Now, you all know about direct democracies, like in ancient Greece, where people vote directly on all the questions. You also all know about representative democracies, like we have in this country and many others, where you vote to elect representatives who then vote on your behalf on all the questions that need to be decided. Liquid democracies are a kind of combination of both of those other two kinds of democracies that have the potential to give you the best of both worlds. In a liquid democracy, if you want to, you can always vote directly on all the issues. But most of us don't begin to have the time or the interest in doing that. So in a liquid democracy, you can also delegate your voting proxy to anyone you want. Could be a friend, a neighbor, some expert you know or know of and trust, anyone you want. You can do that separately for different kinds of issues. So I might give one person my proxy for voting on military issues, somebody else my proxy for voting on environmental issues. And those people can in turn delegate my proxy even further, as many levels as they want, for instance, to people who might know more about a specific question to be voted on. And if at any time I don't like the way the people who have my proxies are voting, I can always take back my proxy, vote directly myself, or give my proxy to someone else. Now, this is not just a theoretical possibility. There are political parties in a number of European countries and other places around the world that have campaigned and been elected on the principle, on the platform, that their representatives will vote for whatever they're told to vote for based on registered voters participating in an online system like this liquid democracy. They've also had been some business decisions made like this. Google, for instance, has made some simple business decisions by letting their employees vote using a liquid democracy like this. So what I think is interesting about this is, first, it's a kind of democracy that couldn't even have existed, at least not on any kind of scale, without computers to keep track of everything. I think it's also possible that this kind of democracy could be much more responsive to the desires of voters and much better able to take advantage of specialized knowledge than our current democracies are today. So that's another example. Let's now look at an example of how markets can help make predictions. I want to tell you about something called prediction markets, where you can buy and sell predictions about possible future events. This is a little bit like betting, but not exactly the same. In a prediction market, if you believe that, say, the sales of your company's products in September will be between 1,500 and 1,600 units, you can buy shares of that prediction. And then, after September is over and the results are known, if your prediction was correct, you get $1 for every share you owned. If your prediction was wrong, you get nothing. It turns out that the prices between 0 and $1 are essentially probability estimates of the combined judgment of all the people participating in the market. And people have experimented and used these prediction markets for a number of decades now. It turns out they're almost always at least as accurate as other kinds of prediction methods like focus groups and polls and so forth, and they're often much better. They've been used successfully for predicting product sales, movie box office receipts, election results, etc. I'll show you an example, for instance, or two examples, from a public prediction market done online, one of my favorite sites like that called PredictIt. I'm going to show you two markets they've done. The first one is a prediction market about whether Donald Trump will still be president at the end of his first term. In other words, he could leave if he's impeached or if he resigns or in some other way. As you can see, the predicted probability of that is about 72%, which seems to me low for a president in office. You can also see, if you look at the bottom, the price history graph, you can see how that's changed over time. For instance, it went down significantly a few weeks ago when the Ukraine news became public. So this shows how these prediction markets can essentially instantly adjust as new information becomes available. Here's one other prediction market you may be interested in of who will win the next presidential election. It shows 41% chance for Donald Trump, 33% for Elizabeth Warren, 12% for Joe Biden, etc. One thing that's interesting here is I'm pretty sure the opinion polls are showing Warren and Biden still about even. That's because they're asking people who they personally are planning to vote for. What's being asked here is not who do you want to win, but who do you think will win? And for several weeks at least, this prediction market has been showing Warren significantly ahead of Biden, which appears to be kind of what's happening. So that's, I think, an interesting example of how these prediction markets can be of special interest. Now, the prediction markets we've just looked at, presumably the participants are all humans. But an interesting question is, what if you had computers participating in prediction markets like this too? This is a question that a student of mine and I thought about a number of years ago, and we decided to experiment with that possibility. We wanted to experiment with something that was analogous to predicting what a competitor would do in business, what a terrorist might do, or what an enemy might do in wartime. But we wanted a simpler, more sanitized example than those. So we decided to try to predict what would be the next play in a football game. The way we did this was we showed people videos of a football game, and we stopped the video just before each play began. We let them participate in a little prediction market, predicting whether the next play would be a run or a pass. We did the same thing with computers. We had some simple computer agents trained with machine learning on one previous football game, and they were able to predict the next play on the basis of a few simple pieces of information like what yard line the ball is on, how many yards to the next first down, etc. And then they would trade with the other computer agents in a prediction market just for computer agents. And finally, we had some prediction markets that included both people and computers. So the people wouldn't even know whether the last trade had been made by another person or by a computer. What we found, as we had hoped, was that the prediction markets that included both people and computers were significantly more accurate and significantly more robust to errors than either computers alone, which were better than people, or people alone. So I think this shows how markets can sometimes be a surprisingly good way of combining human and computer intelligence. Now let me give you two examples of communities. The first is a community or a project called the Human Diagnosis Project. This is for use in healthcare, where doctors or nurses or other medical clinicians can get help on difficult cases they have. The way they do that is by entering information about the cases, like the symptoms, lab test results, etc., enter that into the system, and then they can get advice from anyone else in the world connected to this system. So for instance, a doctor at Mass General Hospital in Boston, across the river from my office, could use this to get a second opinion from doctors, say, at Stanford Medical Center. Or, I think more interestingly, a nurse in a remote African village, hundreds of miles away from the nearest doctor, could also use this to get advice from other experts anywhere in the world. What they find when they use this is that getting multiple opinions and advice like this leads to more accurate diagnoses and better clinical care. That's essentially a result of the hyperconnectivity provided by this worldwide network. They also find that as they use this system, they accumulate a growing knowledge base of cases. And when they apply artificial intelligence machine learning programs to those cases, they found that even with the relatively limited number of cases they have so far, the AI program is able to recognize patterns, and for certain common symptoms like chest pain, those programs are already almost, not quite, but almost as accurate at diagnosing as individual physicians. So what I think is particularly interesting about this is to imagine what will happen when systems like this have not just thousands of cases, but millions of cases. Far more cases than any human doctor is ever going to see in a lifetime. I think it's likely that by then, a system like this can be very accurate at diagnosing many kinds of diseases, and in fact is likely to recognize diseases that humans had never even noticed before. So that's one example of a community. Another example of a community is one we did as a research project in our Center for Collective Intelligence at MIT. In this project, we essentially crowdsourced the problem of what we humans can do about global climate change. We did this by creating an online platform called Climate Colab and a worldwide community of over 120,000 people using this platform. This community included some of the world's leading experts on the topic of climate change, but it also included students, policymakers, business people, and many, many others from all walks of life and from almost literally every country in the world. Together, these people develop and evaluate proposals for what to do about the climate change problem, from how to produce electricity with fewer emissions, to how to reduce emissions from transportation and buildings, to how to change public attitudes about climate. Over the years we've been doing this, a number of pretty interesting ideas have come out. One of my favorite ones is this grand prize winner from a few years ago. It's an idea for a device called the Sun Saluter. That's a rotating solar panel that rotates during the day to follow the sun across the sky, thereby generating more electricity than a fixed solar panel. And the rotation is powered by gravity and dripping water. And as the water drips, it's filtered to make about 4 liters of clean drinking water per day. So the same low-cost device produces both clean water and electricity, 2 critical needs for millions of people in the world. So I think that's a pretty cool idea. But what I think is perhaps even more interesting here is where the idea came from. It didn't come from a professor at MIT or UNM or any other place where you might find people who are real experts on this. The idea came from a young woman, pictured here, who had the basic idea when she was 16 years old and later dropped out of Princeton to pursue this idea full-time. So I think a lesson here is that sometimes the best solutions to difficult problems don't come from the usual suspects. They come from surprising other places. So we've now looked at a bunch of examples of individual processes for decision-making. I now want to give you an example that shows how all the processes can be combined in one. The example I want to use is one that some of you in the room may be very familiar with, which is strategic planning for a company, especially a big corporation like Apple or General Motors or something like that. If you know about this process, it often occurs about once a year, typically. It involves some very senior executives, maybe some outside consultants, perhaps a few other people from inside the company. What I want to suggest to you is how that process of coming up with a strategic plan for a company might be made much more intelligent by involving many more people than is customary and involving more computers. For instance, one thing you could do is let lots of people create ideas for what could go into the strategic plan in something like the same way people created ideas in Climate Collab. You could let anyone in the company, say, propose ideas for new products or new services or changes in how we do things. You could also use what we call a contest web, which we actually used in Climate Collab as well, where you have at one level the basic ideas, and then at another level you have people competing to see who can best put those basic, or some selection of those basic ideas together into a coherent strategic plan for a given business unit. Do that separately for each business unit. And then at another level, you could have people competing to put together the business plans for different business units into a coherent overall strategic plan for the whole company. So that's a way of generating a lot more ideas. Of course, you need to evaluate those ideas. One way you could do that more is to use prediction markets. For instance, you could let lots of people inside the company, maybe even outside the company, predict whether a particular new product would likely be successful in the marketplace, predict what the economic environment might be like in 2 years. You could use many more people to evaluate those things. To do those things, you need to know more about the world outside. What do customers want? What do they do, et cetera. Much of that could happen by sensing, by analyzing lots of big data about customer interactions on the web and so forth. You could also use computers to help people remember things that might help them come up with more good ideas about strategic planning. For instance, there are some generic strategies that business strategists talk about. A company can choose to compete on the basis of low cost or on the basis of high quality or a variety of other things. A system could just suggest those possibilities to people in case they hadn't remembered to do that. You could also use computers to help the whole system learn to be smarter over time, using what I call a cyber-human learning loop. For instance, if you have people who are evaluating elements of the strategic plan, you might let humans do that alone at the beginning, but with computers watching all the inputs and all the outputs and so forth, and looking for patterns in what they see. And over time, if the computers see a pattern in the kinds of things that people typically reject or accept, the computer could start suggesting that to people. And if people take the suggestions many times in a row, the computer could just stop asking and do those things automatically. So over time, it would get smarter and smarter. So what we've seen here is what you might call a cyber-human strategy machine, a system of people and computers that together might be able to be much more intelligent at doing strategic plans. Instead of just doing one plan a year, you might be able to do several plans a week or even a day. You might be able to generate many more possibilities than you usually do and come up with much better solutions, constantly adapting at the end. You might be able to respond as a company much more quickly to any changes by your competitors or customers or anything else. And you might be able to basically just run circles around your competitors. And it might become very hard to even compete with a company that has this kind of super intelligent strategic planning process. So let me now talk about, those are a bunch of examples. Let me now talk about a couple of issues. One issue that we and many other people have wondered about is, can we measure the kind of collective intelligence that a supermind has? My colleagues and I wondered about this a number of years ago and did a study, or several studies about that. What we did was use the same statistical techniques used in individual intelligence tests, like IQ tests, but we applied these statistical techniques to measuring the intelligence of groups. What we found was that just as for individuals, there's a single statistical factor for a group that predicts how well the group will perform on a wide range of different tasks. We called this statistical factor collective intelligence, and we found that it is correlated, the collective intelligence of a group is correlated with the average individual intelligence of the members in the group. But that correlation is only moderate. In other words, having a bunch of smart people in a group isn't necessarily enough to make a smart group. That's something many of you may have already known from your own experience. We certainly see that at MIT. But it raises the question, if that's not enough, what else do we need? So in our research, we found 3 other factors that were significantly correlated with the collective intelligence of a group. The first was the average social perceptiveness, or social intelligence, of the group members. We measured this by showing people pictures of other people's eyes and asking them to guess what emotion the person in the picture was feeling. It turns out when you've got a lot of people in a group who are good at doing that, then on average, the group is more collectively intelligent than when you don't. A second thing we found was that the group's collective intelligence was significantly correlated with the degree to which people participated about equally in the conversation. So if 1 or 2 people dominated the conversation, then on average, the group was less intelligent than when people participated more equally. And finally, we found that the group's collective intelligence was significantly correlated with the proportion of women in the group. Women correlated with more intelligent groups. I usually do get a reaction when I give that result. Interestingly, by the way, it turns out that this last result was mostly explained statistically by the first one. In other words, it was already known before our work that women on average score higher on this measure of social perceptiveness than men. And so one possible interpretation of our result is that maybe what you need for a group to be collectively intelligent is to have a bunch of people in the group who are high on this measure of social perceptiveness or social intelligence. And if you have that, then it may not matter much whether those people are men or women. But if you know nothing about a person besides their gender, you're a little more likely to get that with a woman than with a man. I personally kind of like that interpretation. So we did another study along these same lines where we looked at both face-to-face groups and online groups. In the online groups, the only way people could communicate with each other was by typing text messages to each other. They couldn't even see each other's eyes. But we found that the social perceptiveness or social intelligence of the group members was equally predictive of the group's collective intelligence in both cases. In other words, people who were good at reading emotions in eyes were better at interacting with other group members and being more collectively intelligent even when they couldn't see the other people's eyes at all. So what I think that must mean is that even though the test is measuring one specific skill of reading emotions in eyes, that skill must be correlated with a much broader range of interpersonal skills, like how to guess what other people are thinking or feeling based on what they write, or how they'd react to things you might write, and so forth. So I think one interpretation or one lesson from that is that even in our increasingly electronically connected world of the future, I think interpersonal skills are likely to continue to be very important. Now, that raises another question, which is, what about jobs in general? How are computers going to affect jobs in general? I suspect many of you have heard, and perhaps many of you are worried about whether computers are going to take away our jobs and leave lots of people unemployed forever. I think we should all relax a little bit about that. I think it's unlikely that that will happen. The main reason I think that is because people have been worried about machines taking away human jobs for centuries, ever since at least the Luddites in the 1800s. And every single time people have worried about that, it hasn't happened. Or rather, every single time, some jobs have in fact gone away, but more new jobs have been created than were eliminated. For example, in 1800, about 90% of the US workforce was engaged in agriculture. Today, it's less than 2%. So huge numbers of agricultural jobs were eliminated, but the difference was more than made up for by the growth of jobs in manufacturing, and especially more recently in services. So is it theoretically possible that it'll be different this time? Yes, it's theoretically possible, but I think it's very unlikely that will happen. By the way, I don't mean that we shouldn't worry a little bit about this, because I think there will in fact be some people who lose jobs, and we need to do something, if we can, to help those people, to help them find new jobs, or if they can't, for good reasons, find any new jobs, it seems to me appropriate to do something to help them. But I think the biggest worry that people have is that massive numbers of us will be unemployed for long times, and I think that's very unlikely. Here's one reason I think it's unlikely, one of the most important reasons or phenomena that I think will lead to this, which is that when computers, or any other machines for that matter, but when computers make things much cheaper to do, when they can do things more cheaply than humans can, they make those things cheaper, whether that's products or services or whatever it is. When that happens, people often want to buy more of those things. And even when people want to buy more of them, the computers still can't do everything that's needed to create those new products and services. People are still needed to do some of those things, and I think will be for a long time. And so there are new jobs created for the people to do the things that are now economically desirable and feasible that still require human labor. Let me give you a couple of examples to illustrate that. Think about the technology of the printing press. The printing press essentially eliminated the jobs of scribes, like the guy shown here, but by dramatically reducing the cost of copying printed material, the printing press enabled vastly more kinds of printed material to be created and distributed economically. The printing press made it possible to have not only a few important books copied, but to have novels and magazines and newspapers and comic books and all kinds of things. And producing and distributing all those new kinds of material created jobs for newspaper reporters and magazine editors and copy editors and newspaper delivery people and librarians and on and on and on. So I think that something similar is likely to happen again. Here's another more recent example. Think about the job of a reference librarian, someone who helps people in a library find useful reference materials. And think about how the technology of online search is likely to affect that job. I've looked and haven't been able to find good statistics about this so far, but I suspect that even if the number of reference librarians hasn't decreased yet, I think the growth rate has probably slowed because you can get so much better stuff online with online search than you used to be able to get in a library even with a very good reference librarian to help you. But think of all the new jobs that have been created by online search. Think about not only the jobs for Google's database administrators and software developers, think about jobs for search engine optimization specialists, for website designers, for salespeople for online advertising, and on and on. So I think that's a more recent example that shows what's likely to happen in the future. Now, of course, it's sometimes hard to imagine what these new jobs will look like, but I've already given you tonight some examples that I think suggest some possibilities for what new jobs may be created to do. There may be jobs for people who help do geopolitical predictions or economic predictions, jobs for people who help solve difficult problems that have been crowdsourced, jobs for people who help companies do strategic planning by doing some of the evaluations or some of the ideas. In my book, I talk about many more examples of new kinds of things that people and computers can do together that may, in many cases, lead to new jobs. In fact, in the book, I even talk about some more philosophical things, like, can superminds be conscious? And I have an extended example of Apple Incorporated and raise the question of whether Apple Incorporated, the company, is conscious. I'm not going to go into the details of that with you tonight, but the bottom line is, I think it's not at all stupid to think that Apple, and many other companies for that matter, has a kind of consciousness. So let me leave you with one last thought about where I think we're headed. I think that as our world becomes more and more closely connected with many kinds of electronic communication, it will become increasingly useful to view all the people and computers on our planet as part of a single global supermind. And perhaps our future as a species will depend on how well we're able to use our global supermind to make choices that are not just smart, but also wise. Thank you all very much.